Welcome to this month's AI Meetup. I'm Warren, our product owner for talent here at Amii. And I've always really loved the AI Meetup as one of the ways to get to know some of the faces and the really great work that goes on around our community at Amii, from the students and the researchers to the entrepreneurs and the business leaders that are doing all kinds of really incredible work with AI and machine learning. This is a time where we get to hear all about it, and I'm excited to share today's speakers. Are two really familiar faces from around our tech community. I know we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm not going to belabor the intros for too long here, but first up is going to be Randy Goebel, who is someone that you certainly would recognize from many years of great work with Amii. So I'm going to take the time now just to hand it over to Randy, and we can kick things off with our talks today. There will be a bit of time for Q&A as well, so you can feel free to hit the questions in the chat, and I can pull from those as we finish up Randy's presentation, so we can get all of your questions answered as well. So, Randy, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Oh, I cannot. There we go. Now I can share my screen. Okay. So let me first start by saying that when Laura contacted me, she did so because I have about 10 years experience working in the application of AI to legal reasoning. And I wanted to warn you about something that I will not do. First, just to get your attention. So when I was a faculty member at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Mathematics, I went to introductory graduate course in mathematical logic to learn more about logic because it was one of my passions, and to learn from one of my colleagues whose name was Alan Adamson. In the very first lecture, he said, "Welcome to the class. This is a graduate course in mathematical logic. Now let's dive into the Boolean ultraproduct theorem." Needless to say, he did that because he wanted to reduce the number of people in the audience. I will not tell you about the Boolean ultraproduct theorem, nor will I tell you anything technical about the last decade of work in natural language processing and machine learning applied to legal reasoning. But what I will tell you is something that I hope gets some of your attention with respect to the motivation and challenges in automating legal reasoning. And that aligns with what I know Brent Colvin wants to tell you, Brent from Goodlawyer. So the first thing to address is easily addressed by this phrase that comes from the Canadian College of Physicians and Surgeons, who produced recently, 2021, they produced this cross-country summary of consultations with AI people doing work in AI and precision health, which I also work on. And I think that phrase may be the quickest way to dispel the idea and misconception that AI people like me want to replace lawyers and judges. But if you replace the word physician with lawyer or with judge, you'll get the idea. That's what I've learned over a decade of applying AI to legal reasoning. And I won't read it to you, but you can see that those professionals in the legal profession who do not embrace the use of AI will fall behind and will be replaced. And Brett will say more about that later. So I think that's an initial thing to speak about, because so many artificial intelligence people around the world either believe or are confronted with public questions regarding whether or not we intend the success of artificial intelligence to be measured by replacing humans. The reality is, no matter how abstract a theoretician you are, that's not the intention nor the case. But that hint about people who don't use AI being replaced should guide you into the use of AI in legal reasoning. Now, I'm old enough to have known someone like Joe Weizenbaum, who died 14 years ago, who was one of the first chatbot constructors. So he built a system at MIT called ELIZA, which was modeled after the interactions of a Rogerian therapist. And he studied a lot about the interactions between computer programs and humans. And in the last book he wrote, Computer Powers and Human Reason, he actually addressed this issue about where computers could be used and whether they should be used. I know Joe personally, and in one of his visits to my lab at the University of Waterloo, he said what I've captured here in this quote. And Joe strongly believed that AI could do almost anything like I do. But he also believed there are things that artificial agents should not do. And in particular, making judgments about humans is something that they should not do. That is, the context of humans making decisions about humans was far too precious and context dependent, so should not be relegated to any kind of automated system to make judgments. So couple that with the comments from the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which says you should be using AI to facilitate and support the implicit improvements of legal judgments, but not to replace judges and lawyers. Now, I talk about these kinds of things around the world to AI people, to judges, to lawyers. And one of the things that Canada is unfortunately famous for is the so-called Jordan case. So this is just a description of this Supreme Court case, which comes down to the following. It essentially sets a time limit on when a judgment has to be concluded or it will be dismissed. So think about that for a second, is that what this says is that if there are delays in a judgment, according to from the date when somebody is charged with an offense to the date when a court yields a decision, if that surpasses a certain time frame, then the people are dismissed. Simple as that. It means dismissal. It doesn't mean, oh, well, we restart by another process and we do this, we do that. It means gone. So everything from parking tickets to first-degree murder have been dismissed by the use of the Jordan case. And so that gives you, with the context of the two first slides, some motivation for the deployment of artificial intelligence in legal reasoning, which really amounts to being able to capture knowledge rendered in legal documents and discussions and arguments in a way that allows good lawyers to be even better lawyers, to facilitate faster, more accurate decisions. The last slide I want to show you before I turn it over and is just up till June 2019. There's a process by which you can make an application for a Jordan decision. And it's very hard to get accurate data about this. It's not being hidden or kept secret. It's just fragmented across the country. But up to this time, this is June 2019, nearly 800 criminal cases thrown out over delays. And the photo there is just one from Global News showing the mother and father of a son who was murdered, and the case was thrown out of court. So I have lots of other things I can say, but maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing now, leave that to fuel a discussion, and hand over to Brett.
Thank you, Randy. I know I got the sneak preview on that, but it hit just as hard the second time. Everybody, thanks so much to Amii for having me. It's an honor to be up here with Randy chatting. He's a total legend in the legal tech world. I have a couple questions for you, Randy, just coming out of that. I don't actually have a presentation today for anybody that wants to see how Goodlawyer is trying to change the way that lawyers deliver their services. Just go check out our website, goodlawyer.ca, and it'll feel familiar. You've been on websites like it before in perhaps a different context. But Randy, I completely agree with you on the fact that, law, and the more I was thinking about it, I think it would also relate more to medicine than I thought previously, is fundamentally human. And it's something at some level that we can't allocate that responsibility to AI. It kind of would defeat the purpose, I think, of what the law does and is intended to do, which is govern human relationships more than anything else. That being said, I would love to know, when do you think, because I'm coming at the exact same problem, it feels like, as you, but from a completely different angle, and kind of getting to a bit of a middle ground in terms of AI is not going to replace lawyers, but lawyers who don't use AI will eventually be replaced. From my experience working for many years in the profession, I can tell you that we are a ways off from all lawyers adopting AI in their practice. Frankly, in the 4.5 years I was at one of the large national law firms, I could probably count on one hand the number of times that AI was even mentioned in the context of anything. And that was at, a huge national law firm. And I have friends at all the big ones. And I think the experience is fairly similar. There is a little bit of penetration, but it's still early days. So when do you think AI will be broadly adopted in the legal profession by lawyers, judges, other folks working there?
So this is a good question, because what it does is it forces one to consider the full legal landscape. By that I mean every kind of lawyer, every kind of jurisdiction that has different kinds of law. So there are things, continental law, so-called law, statute law, case law, and in all areas from corporate mergers to civil litigation to criminal court cases, a very broad spectrum of things. But the common denominator there is the time that it takes educated, trained lawyer to be able to identify the relevant background to be able to inform how they inform judges and how judges make judgments. So let me give you an example, is that there's a lot of emphasis these days on regulatory compliance that has given the European system the GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation, which has very broad sweep of the use of information, including legal decisions. And so a legal decision made under GDPR requires a lawyer to expeditiously identify the content and provide an explanation for how a decision was made, for example. So in regulatory compliance, since jurisdictions around the world are producing new documents that say what it means to be regulatory compliant, it means that human lawyers can't keep up with the publication rate of these regulations.
Totally.
So you need software systems that understand enough about language and regulatory language to be able to sift through documents and focus on the appropriate documents for any given case. In case law, that means taking the description of a case and going through jurisdictions that use case law, like Canada, and finding out which cases are the most relevant. In civil law, it means finding which civil law statutes are most relevant to the current situation, then reasoning about them. Now, all of that said, it's incredibly time and knowledge intensive process. And one of the things I want to put a plug in for Goodlawyer and Brett, and what I know about Brett already, is that the attempt is to transform the legal interaction with people needing legal support into a what's the best thing to do scenario, and what's the best way to do that versus billable hours only, depending on how much time a lawyer spends. So the reality is that a poorly informed lawyer is going to spend a lot more time and charge you a lot more money than a well-informed lawyer. And to answer Brett's the question more succinctly, is that at the very least, we can use natural language processing methods today to be able to measure similarities between civil law statutes or case law, given a descriptive case, and say, don't waste your time looking at all of the other information on the horizon. Just look at that and focus yourself.
Yeah.
It's like Google as a lawyer, if you like, if you think about it that way.
Definitely. And I think, the court system, jurisprudence, like that is for sure, in my mind, the most obvious sort of immediate application of AI, because it's like the most centralized repository where there is a ton of data that you can analyze and, train algorithms on, and, all the stuff that you're an expert about. But I think another huge problem, and just sort of moving, I appreciate the plug, Randy. But, beyond just like fundamental issues that I see in the business model of traditional law firms that, aren't revolutionary, frankly, like upfront prices for services are pretty common in most industries.
Yes.
Billing for value and not just like having this incentive to spend as much time on something, very common in most industries. But one of the problems that I see with AI, both in terms of training the models, but also in terms of deploying them broadly across the industry, is the fact that law is so unbelievably fragmented.
Yes.
And, we're experiencing that with Goodlawyer because, part of our MO is to connect these fantastic solo lawyers that, often used to be at big firms, but they're working on their own, and aggregate that. And we've got a partnership with Thomson Reuters to do just that, put higher caliber resources in the hands of these solo lawyers that couldn't get them before. But without that aggregation, you have all of these like literal individuals sitting on their own little piles of contracts or statements of claim or whatever it is. And so how do we connect the dots with all of this fragmentation in law? Like the biggest law firm in the world does a tiny fraction of the legal services globally. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it is a good question, how to deal with scalability and fragmentation of the methods.
Yeah, at the same time, totally.
One of them is I think that maybe because of the conservative nature of law offices, maybe it's law offices that aren't the mechanism for an initial investments in changing things. Let me give you an alternative. Is that let me give you an example from one of the other places in Canada that invests a lot in automating legal reasoning. So there's a cyber justice lab at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and they have built to demonstrate just exactly what Brett said. This is an academic collection of lawyers and computer science researchers who have built automated consultation system for the Quebec Landlord-Tenant Act. And the reason that I bring that up is because I think that may be where the initial foray into addressing the fragmentation is. So first, they don't have a vested interest in building it to be able to match their business model because they're not making money from it. They're producing this online interactive system so that a layperson like me can go to this online system and get guidance about the situation I face. So I can go there and I can plead my case and say, I've just received notice of eviction for this reason, but the reason doesn't make sense to me. Can I interact with the system to get some explanation of how the local jurisdiction deals with that situation? Now, encapsulate all of Randy's ramblings into one thing that says, maybe it's not the law offices that have to motivate this. Maybe it's the non-governmental organizations like the legal justice labs like this one, or maybe it's the jurisdictional publicly funded legal systems like Alberta Justice that have to somehow make the case for investments in improving the public system by using these tools, so that all the way back to that first slide is the lawyers who don't use AI will be at a disadvantage. So that's one way to think about the answer to your question.
I love that answer, Andy. I hadn't thought of it from that lens. My obvious solution is for Goodlawyer to be giant, and then we'll just plug it in. But I couldn't agree with you more. Doing it from because there's so much, like that's where there's sort of access to justice issues across the board And we're trying to help that in like the small business sense. But
Yes.
the majority of access issues we see certainly are personal matters that just go unresolved because, as you showed in your presentation, it can take years and years to get through the court system. It's just not worth it, both on the civil and, family and criminal fronts.
Yes.
I think that it does feel like it's, especially with, guys like yourself and Amii being in Edmonton, that the Alberta government could really push this forward. We saw it in BC with alternative dispute resolution and a lot of the, huge advancements that they made. Frankly, they were like one of the leading sort of dispute resolution things publicly funded that I've ever seen globally. It does seem like that does fall into the kind of government's lap and should be a priority.
Two things related to that is just before the pandemic started, I had 3 projects that we were about to initiate with Alberta Justice, but the pandemic has been the cause of further delays, as you know, in courts. So we haven't been able to restart that. And other jurisdictions. So in China, as I understand it, secondhand from Chinese colleagues, is that you can actually choose to resolve civil matters by going to a semi-automated dispute resolution process, like what you mentioned in British Columbia. So we're starting to see that, and it's coming exactly as you suggested. Now, I also have to say that large companies like Westlaw, who works with Thomson Reuters, and Denton's, who started their own AI and law laboratory in, I think it's in Menlo Park, might be Palo Alto. Some of the big law firms are seeing that there's the requirement for an investment to keep up so that they don't fall behind other developments in that way. So it's starting to happen, but the small law firms can't afford to do that, right? They can't afford to divert themselves from the current business model that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I definitely not. They're just trying to make it day by day, in a lot of cases. But I mean, even when we look at, Denton's with their own AI lab trying to stay, sort of at the forefront of technology and law. My experience in talking to folks at a number of the big shops, it always feels a little bit reactive. Like the clients are pulling it out of them. Absolutely. And then they react to it. And even when we're talking about the government, BC created their dispute resolution piece. If there's any Alberta government folks on this, like, I certainly encourage us to look more intensely into access issues and how, AI can help alleviate a lot of those issues. But I feel for like the Law Society as an example, who they don't have the resources. Like, even at the sort of regulatory level, law is incredibly fragmented. You have these bodies like the Law Society of the Yukon. Like, how many lawyers do you think fall under that bar association? Like, so the fragmentation, I think is a key problem, no matter which way you slice it, big firm, government, it still proposes challenges. And
Bruce Maddox has popped up his head. He probably has a question, Brett.
Oh yeah,
I do have a question. Thank you. So there's 2 parts to the problem. One, of course, is the use of AI, and obviously we don't want machines to do law. We want ultimately people to be responsible, but there's still the reasoning part. And we want to have engines that do the reasoning, but it's obviously complex. And the problem with having large companies own the reasoning is then the knowledge becomes hidden and obscured and not available to the general public. To some degree, it seems to me, and maybe both of you can comment on this, is maybe we need like national infrastructure. It's almost like AI is like the new roads, it's like the new sewer, or the new, water. Like, maybe we need public infrastructure to do this stuff, and we should be, as AI research, you contribute to it in some way. And it could even be federated in the sense that, there are many, many different problems when you look at law, and they break out both in terms of the kind of reasoning required to do law, but also the different kinds of law that exist and the very specific domains of knowledge that exist in all these different areas. And investments need to be made in all of it. But then who owns it, right? And then who gets to make money from it, and who gets to benefit from it? And I think, we have a unique problem in Canada. We have Canadian law. We have Alberta law. Should there be federated infrastructure that, that we contribute to, but yet is somehow owned publicly?
Go ahead, Brett. I'll let you comment first.
I was gonna, sure. I don't know enough about what AI infrastructure would look like, but just speaking more broadly to technology infrastructure, absolutely. I think that, what do we call it? The Federation of Law Societies of Canada, I think. There is kind of an association that is intended to be, a bit of an aggregator for the law societies to put out model rules and that kind of thing. I think that should go a step further. I think that, there should be like a minimum provision for, say, legal aid in each province and territory in our country, that there is some baked in technology in terms of how we're delivering those services. I don't know if it's like this today, but I can tell you that a few years ago, certainly, if you're calling legal aid or calling for lawyer referral, you're talking to a person that is in the desk taking 100, 200, 300 calls a day. And like, there is simple technology that could alleviate that strain in a pretty dramatic way that doesn't even require AI. The ability to inject AI to better source you to the right lawyer, from like a legal aid standpoint, to me would be hugely, hugely valuable. But I'll let Randy talk more about what a general sort of AI foundation would look like.
Well, I think it's correct I can tell you all about the technologies that are currently deployed, but it's correct to take the stance that both Bruce and Brett have spoken of, is where does the data reside and who owns it? Let me give you two contrasting situations. And so the legal reasoning competition that me and my Japanese colleagues, that this team of, actually we have 7 people now, have been running for almost a decade, relies on free access to documented law. So on the civil case side, we have all of Japanese statute law translated to English and to Korean. And we have Japanese bar law exams translated to English. And one of the competitions to test AI methods of any kind is to answer those bar law questions. The computer programs that we deploy, we have the last competition had 26 participating teams from 14 countries. We also have access to Canadian case law because it's so easily publicly available, although it's showing signs on the edges because the curation of the documents for case law itself costs money and is expensive. But Colin Lachance from VLEX and others, now he and one of my former research scientists, postdocs, have started a company called Jurisage, which gives you access to that information. The contradiction, to speak to it, is rampant in fragmentation in the United States. So for example, United States state district courts have, for the most part, subcontracted the management of the content of court decisions to private companies who now charge for access to public decisions. And that creates exactly the situation Bruce noted, is that if I deploy my publicly accessed AI systems to help make courts more efficient and lawyers more efficient, there are places where you have this sort of dead zone where you can't get access to stuff like for example, public publication of scientific research papers. So I think the only way to keep that in balance is to develop that public infrastructure, whether it's federal or provincial in Canada. But that takes someone to champion and lead the public investment to say what we need. And right now I've seen that come only from provincial jurisdictions. I haven't seen it discussed at a federal Department of Justice, for example.
Mm-hmm. But like, this kind of makes me think of, you must be familiar with Ross Intelligence, Randy.
Yes, I've been an advisor for them through their lifetime, yes.
And like, who owns a court decision? Like,
yeah,
no one owns a court decision. I feel like
exactly.
Court, maybe like,
yeah,
maybe just for, I think that's an interesting story.
Yes.
And you're probably a lot closer to it than I ever was, but I have met Andrew and am familiar with the Ross journey for a long time, kind of leading legal tech in Canada. You want just refreshing how that all played out, because they are no longer in operation, right?
Well, in fact, I think the good news is that it hasn't played out. So what, for everybody else's benefit, Ross Intelligence was started by two guys, a lawyer, and Andrew, what's Andrew's surname? You remember?
Arruda.
Andrew Arruda and Jimbo Obidajili was the CTO, a graduate of U of T. And what they started doing is taking a variety of technologies available as open source to be able to deploy it and build models to predict which case law examples and which legal documents were most relevant to a description case. They operated and changed their model over the years for about 3 or 4 years. Then they were taken to court. By a company called Westlaw, who said that Ross Intelligence infringed on intellectual property from Westlaw. The reality is that they did not. And this is part of the confusion in AI terms, is that deploying public open source code does not infringe on anybody's rights. But if you've got lots of lawyers like Westlaw and very deep pockets, you can actually shut down small companies by forcing them to pay attention to the legal cases. So after discussions with the lawyers in San Francisco that Ross has hired, and giving them advice about who to find people who are not in conflict of interest, like me as an advisor, the case has been revised to the point where maybe now Ross will get a positive decision in a court. So it's kind of like gone full circle. But it's an example of nothing, depending on your point of view, regardless of your point of view of whether this is just a law firm trolling to kill competition. It's an existing case where one has to sort out the intellectual property in a way that makes sense, as opposed to having it implicitly rest with the people who have the most money and the most lawyers.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Randy. And, I think that was, for me, part of the inspiration for Goodlawyer on day one. I was billing out at $500 an hour. I was seeing a tiny scrap of that and, was making pretty good money, but grinding all the time and not certainly ever able to help anybody that I actually knew, any friend or anything I had. No chance that you could ever afford my billable. And I think that's just a reflection that the little guys, so to speak, have been at a huge disadvantage in the world of law, probably since we started coming up with laws and interpreting them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do think that recognition at, probably, the government level, maybe more broadly speaking, the societal level, on the importance of access to justice, and I mean that incredibly broadly speaking, the importance of access to understanding the rules that we all live by. Because, in the case of Ross, it's unclear whether, it seems clear from your perspective that they were not offside, but, we're going to have to wait 5 years. Maybe it'll get thrown out for delay.
Well, in fact, my Japanese colleagues on this team that run this worldwide competition frequently speak of access to justice as the democratization of law. And so, of course, all of the natural language processing techniques that continue to emerge from theoretical AI labs are producing candidates as software to provide more principled access to the large volume of legal documents so that mere humans like me can actually understand those legal decisions.
And mere humans like you can teach me what they mean.
Go ahead,
yeah.
Bruce. Oh, you're muted though. Very powerful device to mute Bruce.
But I'll ask sort of the related question. I mean, and then it goes back to the cost of the infrastructure. So large language models are taking over in AI in a lot of different ways. I mean, you look at what GPT-3 can do, or now there was just an announcement about Bloom, which is this open source thing. But these things really cost hundreds of millions of dollars, these models to develop, and they're super intelligent. I mean, so if you think about, Alberta law for a specific problem, right? To build a large language module that will actually model that will actually do the reasoning, it costs like no individual lawyer is going to be able to pay for that. So who should pay for it? So then if you have some company like Westlaw that pays for it, well, then that's probably bad, right? But maybe we should put our shekels together, and build this, but then all participate. But how do you do that?
Yeah, I think you're right. You have to build that consortium based on the old model that Bruce and I are familiar with, which is consortium of trusted partners who see strategic value in moving things along, but can't do it on their own. We've done that with all kinds of infrastructure, from electricity grid to infrastructure for roads and highways, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, lobbying is effective. Lobbying costs money.
Yeah.
And who is lobbying for access to justice?
Yes. No. Yeah.
Good lawyer, very cheaply, Randy, from his office. Like, who is lobbying for access to justice?
Yeah.
Nobody.
No, and that's all the way back full circle to the description of non-government organizations and of the government departments of justice. So the people I know in Alberta Justice are lobbying for access to justice because it's one way to make the justice system more transparent and more efficient. But the advocates for that are a small handful of people, and that has to change.
Yeah, and I mean, even just like the rules in law that prohibit any non-lawyer in Canada from owning any part of a legal service provider,
right?
Which is also like a totally insufficient definition, because you have companies like, Law Depot, one of the largest templates providers in the world, based out of Edmonton. And, these proliferate, people are using them. There's no enforcement mechanism to stop anybody. I'm sure they've given up on that now. With the Legal Zooms and the Law Depots of the world. But how that is different than, engaging with a professional in some weird way, still baffles me. And I think that, we saw it happen in the UK, call it a decade ago, when the Competition Bureau came in and changed the rules and took the self-regulation away from the lawyers because of access to justice. That was the core principle. And, change has been still quite slow. It's a very, like you said, Randy, risk adverse kind of industry. But we're seeing more progress than in places like Canada, and certainly than the US when it comes to, starting to think about how do we fund AI in law? How do we just fund technology in law more broadly?
Yep, that's right. More comments from anyone?
Well, maybe I'll ask you, Randy, about kind of what you see as the state of the art in law today. Large language models actually kind of becoming really dominant. So are we reaching the stage where I could go to Law Depot and have a GPT-3 like system just generate a legal document for me? That's really, really good. And what's missing, and how is the state of the art evolving?
Well, it's a good question. I was going to make a comment about that, but now you've invited that comment. So, I guess the first comment is that all of the so every year we write a summary description of all of the methods used in this international competition on statute law and case law, and the competitions are difficult. Lots of groups have dropped out because the investment of time and energy is too high. With that said, the collection of competitors is still growing. Everyone uses some form of machine learning, and everyone uses some form of language model of the kind you mentioned. None of them will exclusively rely on the properties of the large language models, because let me give you an example about why. So the most aggressive recent project proposal amongst a group of us in Germany, France, UK, Japan, and Canada was to start a research project that curated legal document databases and built annotation systems to understand legal arguments. That is, to actually find arguments written in text and discern a chain of inferences from antecedents and consequence, and to be able to understand those, extract legal arguments. No transformer, whether you've spent 100 million on it like GPT-3, none of them know anything about that, because what they are is statistical models of language use. So that means you can generate a legal document that looks sort of reasonable. What you can't do is generate an explanation of why it's reasonable or where the main arguments are in the document. But we use them, for example, because the simple single source of error in all of these competitions are 70% of the errors made in the competitions are due to misunderstandings of language. Either language is so powerful, every language, in terms of paraphrase. So a lawyer writing something one way and a lawyer writing the same thing another way cannot be converged. So you use transformers to compare how close documents are, for example. Furthermore, the identification of arguments and legal structure in documents is even more difficult to find than just doing the paraphrase thing. And so, while the current status is that we don't know enough about how language is used to write legal documents, and we learn by building these transformers or using them to compare legal documents, for example, but the jury is out, so to speak, pun intended, about where we can gather enough information to build a large corpus of legal argument databases, so we can go find those. And then, for example, back to Brett, you've got a description of a legal case, and you want to find out what legal cases are technically noticed in the jurisprudence you have access to. You want more than that. You want not just those cases that seem syntactically related, which you can use by filtering with the transformer, but you want to know which arguments are the strongest and which arguments actually contradict each other, which could be used before a judge and which are specious and should be just abandoned. That's sort of the edge of the current state of the art, is we don't know how to do that very well. Yet in specific instances, we can use those tools to, for example, do risk analysis of where the riskiest texts are in a legal document generated automatically. Back to Bruce's question. I don't know if that gives you the full circle.
Yeah, Randy, and then layer in the context of today, right now, versus absolutely. Yesterday, versus a month ago, versus 10, you know what I mean? Like, it is like this very complex kind of array of inputs.
Well, this is probably a good way to do this as we get close to the end. Let me share your screen with one of these kinds of examples. So here is the competition we run, is the competition on legal information extraction and entailment. And this is one of the statute law challenges. And so the challenges is that a computer program, not a human, is given a question that's on the right side. And the computer program has to sift through Japanese, Korean, and English translations of Japanese statute law to be able to first identify statutes. In this case, there's one statute identified on the left, which is written there. I won't read it to you. And then answer the question whether or not the argument in this statute applies to the case on the right, so that you can say yes or no. This is, I like this example because it's so obviously a Japanese example. All of the questions in this competition come from the Japanese bar law exam. And our team at U of A has won the competition several times. The highest score we got was about 70% on the Japanese bar law exam, yes, no questions, this case. But I can't answer this question. I don't have enough legal knowledge in my head, not enough nomenclature to be able to argue whether or not the statute on the left produces an answer to the question on the right. So this is another way of demonstrating the answer to Bruce's question, to say, we have computer programs that can do this using all of the current technologies underlying it. We're already doing better than the average layperson, because I certainly can't answer this question. I know what the answer is because I've used this example so many times. But on the face of it, that gives you an example of the kind of thing that you face.
Well, Randy, you got my law school brain buzzing.
Okay.
The only thing that let's play it through. The one thing that is leaving me hanging is what this manager, who is the manager?
Yeah.
If I knew who the manager was, I think I can answer this question.
That's exactly an issue of paraphrase and language use for sure, right? So in this case, the decision that came out for the Japanese bar law exam question on the right was that this statute is confirmed that the person who pushed the person out of the way of the car was the manager and is not liable to compensate for the damages to the kimono.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But right, that's the kind of knowledge that one needs to deploy to be able to get access to that kind of information, as Bruce said.
Totally. And I think it brings us back to kind of your original point on your first slide, which is AI is not going to replace lawyers.
Right.
But, lawyers that don't use any AI will be replaced. It really is that combination of giving the lawyer the superhuman tools to deal with this insane mass of information.
Yes.
There's like two layers of knowledge though, right? One layer of knowledge is just find this stuff, right? I mean, and AI is pretty good at that, right? I mean, just finding documents, sifting through it, sorting through it or whatever. But there's this other layer of knowledge that's much, much more difficult. And that is converting this document into something that you can reason about, right? And we do have really, really great reasoning engines. Like this is, theorem provers and code generators and whatever. They can do this, but somehow it hasn't made its way into law yet, right? But maybe there's a business opportunity there, right? Because I can charge you to get the document, but then I can charge you maybe to apply AI to the document to convert the document into a reasonable, logical framework that can be used by another engine reasoning.
Yep, absolutely. Well, what Bruce just said is one of the trajectories of the so-called neurosymbolic paradigm emerging in AI is that
right.
People are starting to give up on deep learning only and saying, well, what if we could reason about it? And your comments about the theorem provers are exactly what drives this worldwide consortium of finding and confirming legal arguments. The idea is that you should be able to prove a judicial decision as a consequence from the appropriately identified antecedents in a legal argument. Absolutely true.
I'm just going to interject here with I have a comment and a question for you before we start to wrap up. First off, this has been a really awesome conversation. I love Randy is maybe the only person I've ever heard refer to themselves as a layperson and then also throw out a term like neurosymbolic paradigm. So just want to shout that out. That's awesome. But so there's been lots of really cool examples about the status of the technology and how it can be applied in some of the challenges in how it's applied in legal reasoning and in the legal world. I'm interested in kind of finishing off on like, what are some of the maybe speculations or maybe some optimism around filling that gap between around technology adoption in legal practice. Like if we know the technology is capable of doing these things, and we know, from Brett's experience, maybe law firms are a little bit, outdated or conservative in how they approach technology or even just business practice and management overall. It sounds like there's a pretty big gap between what can be done and how law firms actually operate. So, if you're talking to a lawyer, what are some of the things that you would maybe suggest as like a next step or something that they can do now to maybe start to fill that gap a little bit more and leverage some of the potential around AI in legal practice?
Well, let me give you a quick reminder of some of the things we've talked about that address that, and then turn it to a real lawyer, Brett. So remember, I talked about the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and there is similar in China. Strangely enough, if you don't believe all the American propaganda, they have some very advanced systems for doing this kind of thing. But the point is this, is that what's driving the change is something like the regulatory environment that requires the explanation of a judicial decision or a decision to award you a loan or not, or so on and so forth. And so if the regulations overreach their mandate, they actually help create momentum for law firms to have to deal with that technology. And I think that's an unforeseen consequence, is that GDPR is so broad and overwhelming that everybody's now worried about building systems that are self-aware enough to be able to provide explanations. And that comes directly back to what Bruce articulated as the infrastructure for the corpora, that I understand it as proving consequences from antecedents identified in legal arguments. So I'll give Brett the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think lighting a fire under sort of all the necessary people's butts, most case lawyers, when it comes to, there is this feeling as a lawyer that, the expectation more often than not is perfection. Like there is not a lot of wiggle room and that is certainly a stress that drives a lot of lawyers in the work that they do. And I saw that everywhere I went in law, which I guess is kind of part of the job, but it really is this kind of expectation of perfection in everything that you do, which is obviously impossible. And we rectify things, but that's like the feeling. So that's definitely one avenue, but I would say that I would argue maybe a simpler, in a way, approach that we've taken, certainly a good lawyer, that I think will impact this is just how lawyers sell their services. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, the broken incentive model that is the billable hour. And in some instances, maybe it makes sense, but certainly not every instance. I can tell you that because we sell fixed fee services every day. And I think changing the incentive structure really drives innovations like that. Because if I have, a fixed price for a large mandate, I want to get that mandate done as well and as quickly as possible, versus the current sort of standard, which is, I'm going to let you know when I'm done, and I'm going to give you the final price when I'm done. And it just really bakes in, why would I, try this new thing, this new AI thing that can speed me up, when like my net result of speeding myself up is I'm going to actually make less money. So I do think the core kind of business model, moving away from the billable hour, is going to be a major driver towards broader technology and AI adoption in law.
Agreed.
Right. I think that's a really good point to finish on. I do want to say a heartfelt thank you to Brett and Randy for sharing their expertise on this topic. I think it's a really fascinating area to dig into, and lots of great questions and conversation today. So I know these are also people that you can bump into, at other AI meetups and events. This week is obviously a really busy one here in Edmonton. So hopefully you'll have a chance to see some faces at this event out there in the wild at some of the Startup Week and Tech Aid activities that are going on. I'm just going to pull up my screen here and a few final items.
Well, you do that, Warren. A selfish plug for AI and law visitor, the director of legal informatics from University of Saarland, is both a lawyer and a judge, and he's giving the Amii talk on Friday at noon.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one. This is it's awesome to see so many incredible things happening in our community here in tech and in machine learning, even just in this single week. So thanks to everyone for...
Warren, can I just say one last final thing here? Just because I think, I assume the majority of folks on this call are from Alberta. We are in a unique position in Alberta right now, where we do have one of the most progressive, and I don't know if it's saying a ton, but we have folks at the government, at law society levels, that even the ASC, when we're talking about a lot of the new fintech rules that are coming out, we have an appetite in Alberta. We always have to be entrepreneurs, to be our own thinkers, and we have Amii in Alberta, one of the most well-known, respected artificial intelligence organizations in the world. We got a guy like Randy, and so if there was a place to change how lawyers think about AI, how the world thinks about lawyers, I don't see any reason why it can't be in Alberta.
Nice compliment. Thanks, Brett.
I couldn't agree more. This has been fantastic. Thank you both so much. To those tuning in or watching this down the road, we run these meetups every month. You'll find the next one coming up on November 22nd. It's going to be talking about using machine learning for monitoring blood sugar, blood glucose levels for diabetes research. It's going to be a really interesting topic. And you can find all kinds of upcoming events and activities by signing up for the newsletter here. So I'd encourage you to do that. Stay in the loop, and hopefully we'll see you out this week. We have a sold-out Tech Aid event heading into this weekend, where there's going to be a ton of activities to show off the latest and greatest tech research and emerging science coming out of the U of A, as the team mentioned here today. And we can't wait to see you there in our new Amii space that's going to be opening soon. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and we look forward to crossing paths again very soon.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks.